Yesterday, a French national opened fire with a machine gun on a police van on the Champs-Élysées, killing one officer, Xavier Jugele. Officers engaged the attacker in a shootout in which 2 officers were wounded and the attacker was eventually killed. We want to tell you a little bit about his background because immediately in the aftermath, very shortly after, just a couple of hours after the shooting, ISIS claimed responsibility for the attack. And I have seen reports, although it doesn't seem definitive, that there was some sort of literature found in the scene defending ISIS. So it does appear that it was affiliated in some fashion with ISIS. But the same gentleman back in 2005 was convicted on 3 counts of attempted murder. France 24 reports that 2 of the targets back 12 years ago were police officers. More recently, police had been watching him as a potential terrorism suspect, as they watch so many. Of course, it's always extremely unfortunate when an act like this happens and you find out that they were worried about this individual. Unfortunately, nothing was done in this case. Now, as I said, ISIS claimed responsibility through its official propaganda outlet just a couple of hours after. Now, what's interesting about this is that this person does seem, in the propaganda that they had on their person, to have been affiliated with ISIS, but we also know that going back more than a decade before the birth of ISIS, they had been attempting very similar acts. And so while it appears that this was an act of terror in which a police officer unfortunately lost their life and others were wounded, it also seems like in many other cases that this is a person who had significant mental issues, had a criminal past, and then eventually began to be affiliated with ISIS. They have been looking in the background and they haven't found any other outward like statements in support of ISIS or anything like that yet that could be forthcoming. But it is interesting, and we'll get into the political ramifications domestically for France in just a little bit.
Yeah, from an international perspective as to this ramifications, that's an interesting conversation. So first, I don't think it's that interesting a question as to whether it's terrorism. Almost certainly it is, and okay, check, we did it. So it appears to be Islamic radical terrorists. Okay, that was said. Hopefully that'll solve it soon. It doesn't seem to have worked yet, and even the president said it. It still hasn't worked. So I know that under Obama, these would be blamed on how Democrats were too soft and everybody else was too soft. Doesn't seem to be sticking out Trump. Trump seems, if anything, almost celebratory of it, saying that yes, this will probably affect the French elections. I mean, I'm sorry to see it happen, right? So, okay, now we know for a fact that terrorism, not just homicides, not just crime, but terrorism is much lower today than it was, for example, in the 1970s. 1970s in Europe, we had the Boss separatists, we had the IRA, we had much higher incidence of terrorism. Did we invade Ireland? Well, the UK and Ireland had a lot of propaganda and had a lot of conflict there, and obviously in other places as well. The question is, what do you do once you've labeled it as terrorism? And unfortunately, there isn't much to do here. ISIS has won the branding contest between ISIS and Al Qaeda. They used to say, yeah, I'm with Al Qaeda. Now they say, yeah, I'm with ISIS. And ISIS seems to be more connected to this than others. Some of the other attacks, like they even timed it out. It usually takes them 10 hours to take responsibility. And this one, they did it in record time in 2.5 hours. And there might have been conversations with ISIS back and forth, which lately there hasn't been. It's just BS, I guess I'm with ISIS. This one seems more real in that there might have actually even communicated. But what do you do with that fact? We're already bombing ISIS into oblivion, and we're already getting ready to, take on Raqqa with the help of allies on the ground. Okay, what do we do next? And I'm not sure there's a great answer.
Well, you make sure that somebody who was convicted of 2 counts of attempted murder is not able to buy a gun so quickly in the first place. I mean, that to me is the egregious understory here, is that this guy was out of jail. He was convicted of attempted murder on 2 police officers, and he's got a gun, and he's in the streets. So I think that's a good place to start. Forgetting the terrorism. I mean, the other thing that we've talked about this before, but can a Muslim just commit a crime? A Muslim person just commit a crime anymore, or is it always terrorism?
Well, that was more of an interesting question recently in Fresno.
Yes,
right,
absolutely.
Yeah, where they're like, okay, was it racism or was it terrorism?
Right.
I would argue that it's both, because I have a narrower and a broader definition of terrorism. What I mean by that is, I think we way overuse terrorism. So now everybody who's an enemy of ours is terrorist, and then everyone across the world has adopted it. So in Turkey, for example, Erdogan calls even journalists who write against them as terrorists. Right. Putin calls everybody who's against him a terrorist. The most overused
people against
word.
the referendum were terrorists.
That's in Turkey. That's right. Outrageous, ridiculous use of the word, started by us here in America. On the other hand, what I mean by broader is the right-wing terrorists here in America that murder cops, that murder black people in churches, that shoot up Jewish Holocaust museums, obviously are terrorists.
Right.
The same way that Muslims are terrorists, but the media is amazing. When it's a Muslim, immediate conversation, is it terrorism? And usually it's not even a conversation, usually it just is, right? And then they don't even have the conversation when a right wing does it, or the guy who's just arrested with 1,000 rounds of ammunition who was going to shoot everybody up who's a sovereign citizen. When you're going to shoot and murder innocent civilians, and you're doing it for a political purpose, if that's not terrorism, then we should absolutely stop using the word.
Yeah. I think as they figure out, the investigation is obviously in the early days, but as they figure out what those links are here, the problem is these days if ISIS can claim responsibility because it works for ISIS to claim responsibility every time, whether they had something to do with it or not. As they figure out whether there was any support and preparation or training beyond just I went online and saw some videos and got inspired to act, then that's a point of concern. But the other problem is our vocabulary and the way we talk about these security threats hasn't changed, hasn't shifted from the foreign narrative. So we're constantly talking about Raqqa and the battles out in other countries, whereas most of these attacks are not happening from people who were born and raised in those countries.
Right.
Yeah.
This was a Frenchman.
Right.
Exactly.
Belgium was a Belgian national. I mean, it just keeps the German. I believe the German was a German national. So it's that's what happens.
So I know what the right wingers out there are screaming into their sets right now, or actually started screaming the minute we started the video, no matter what we were going to say, which is, but you guys are leaving out the fact that they're Muslims, and that's the real problem. But by that definition, right-wing terrorism in America is a significantly larger problem than Muslim terrorist attacks. That's a fact. That's a fact by our own government, Department of Homeland Security, etc., that they've killed far more people, there's been far more attacks. So is it helpful to say, okay, it's the right wing, and so now they're Americans, kind of, but they're right-wing Americans, and we should label them as such and make sure we act accordingly? No, it smears all of the right wing, and that's not necessarily fair. And the same, of course, applies to Islam when you take some individuals who did it and apply it to 1.6 billion people.
Yeah, and the thing, we shouldn't be surprised by this and how it changes over time. Nobody thinks about murdering people and gets weapons over the course of a year or two, comes up with a plan. Like this guy apparently had some sort of map with different police departments marked off on it. This is a guy that's wanted to kill cops for more than a decade. Nobody does all of that, and all during that time reads no books, goes to no websites, has no philosophical interest, talks to no group. They all either, if they're in America, they're likely to be interested in the sovereign citizen movement, or they go to white supremacist websites. If they're Muslim, it might be some sort of affiliation there. That's what criminals do. They could be involved with gangs. They're never just they don't just go home and then sit in a chair and stare at the wall before their act of violence. They have affiliations, but as you said, we find some affiliations to be more interesting. We find some affiliations to be more damning, and so we stress them, whereas in other cases we don't. And it doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be religion. If somebody shot up a school and was really into violent video games back in the 90s, that's what a lot of the coverage was about. It doesn't matter if they also had coloring books. There's certain things we focus on and certain things that we don't focus on. Some just have more immediate political cachet these days.
And but can I just pause there, because I think, John, that's exactly the point of this story, right? Which is that what are the consequences? What are as we started talking about, right? And what are the decisions we're going to make out of this? So, for example, in the US, when there was this huge IRA terrorism going on in the UK and in Northern Ireland, UK, there was plenty of propaganda against the Irish, right? In America, there wasn't. There's a lot of Irish in America, and it wasn't like, IRA, when are we gonna bomb the Irish? Look, it is intrinsic to the Irish personality to be this violent. It is obvious, look at them. They're the most violent people on earth. At that point, they probably were, right? Not because they're Irish, because of that certain socio-political situation that they found themselves in. But we chose not to do that propaganda. We are choosing now to do a propaganda about a certain group of people that are doing this. Not the mass shooters, not the right-wing terrorists. and you not the regular murder that's going on, and all these other problems, and a lot of which are much larger problems. We're choosing to do propaganda about this so that we can go to Raqqa, so that we can launch those wars, etc. And some folks at home genuinely believe it, and they go, "Oh, no, they were doing that because Islam is a unique, intrinsic problem." Yada yada.
The other problem that especially Muslims in America face is that there are so few of us. So if you're trying to talk about 3.5 million people as if everyone practices the religion the same way and feels the same way about it, you're never going to get there. Yeah. But it's a lot easier to otherize a group that is smaller, that doesn't have the same political voice or impact or power that other voices have. You can't look at Dylan Roof and say, well, there's something in the Christian religion here that propelled him to do that, and not expect Christians all over America to say, no, that's not what our religion is about, which is the same thing Muslims have been saying, but in smaller numbers with a smaller voice.
And there are differences too. I mean, you talk about the IRA, it was much more localized to bombings in London and Brighton and different parts of, in that part of the world, whereas this has become, I would say an overblown epidemic, but still it's a little bit different.
Yeah. Our reporter Jordan Chatton broke the Donna Brazil story. He was right, she just apologized for it. Help us get more reporters like that. You're the one responsible for that. Thank you, and let's do more right now at tytnetwork.com/go.